Hello, everybody. This is King Crocoduck, your host of Complete Crock. I'm here with my co-hosts, the Academic Agent and Zarathustra's Serpent. Today's topic, does socialism have any merit? This was a topic that Academic Agent requested. He made a video today about it, and in it, he gave us 6 reasons, was it? Was it 6 reasons?
It was
What?
6.
Yeah, 6 reasons, the best number. 6 reasons why he thinks socialism is basically ass. So, Agent, why don't you lay them out for us, and we'll maybe get started talking about those.
Yep. Actually, it was originally 7. I left my notes in my office, and I forgot what my 7th reason was. So that's why it ended up being 6.
Okay.
Well,
Are you?
oh, you don't have the notes on you right now.
No. I saying that when I made my video earlier on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's hear them then. What are the 6 reasons why socialism is ass, in your opinion?
So basically, the first case against it is moral, and that is that fallacy of Cain, from Cain and Abel. It is the politics of envy. It basically boils down to the idea that you've got something that I want, I don't have it, I feel hard done by that I don't have what you have, and therefore I'm going to forcibly take it off you. Would anyone? I mean, we can go through the merits of these arguments or lack thereof in a moment, but that's essentially what my first point was. And Jordan Peterson, I have to credit with the Cain and Abel analogy, because I've heard him before. The second argument is that it lies. It's built on lies. Socialists will always say that the rich are getting richer, poorer. But what they actually mean is that the gap, as in the gap between how much money the rich have versus how much money the poor have, has changed. They're not talking about real flesh and blood human beings, because on no objective measure is somebody who's poor in the year 2017 literally eating KFC for, I don't know how much KFC is. What is it, like $15? I mean, you can buy a McDonald's cheeseburger for 99 cents. So you could have $5 and eat 5 cheeseburgers if you wanted to. Versus people in the 1950s, 1930s, 80s.
Right.
I mean, for the, if you look at the long durée, long scheme of history, we're talking about thousands. So I mean, there's no comparison between the workers of now and the workers back then. Do you want me to continue, or do you guys want to come in?
Yeah, I'll start with your first objection, the politics of greed. It's based in coveting your neighbor's goods. Isn't that what capitalism is also based on?
No, it isn't. Capitalism is based on the idea that I want to provide good things that people want for. So in exchange for some money, I will give you, whether it's bread or sausages or YouTube videos or whatever else it is. That's how capitalism works. So people often talk about greedy capitalists, but they forget about the fact that people are getting things in exchange.
True, but couldn't one make a similar argument for socialism? And regarding what you just said, I'm reminded of Adam Smith's famous quote. I don't remember it exactly, but the butcher does not sell meat simply because out of the kindness of his heart. The tailor does not sell clothes out of the kindness of his heart. There are incentives at play.
Right, and yes, and so the baker or the butcher is incentivized to provide the best possible bread or the best possible sausages, because if he doesn't, people are going to go to the baker down the street who provides a better bread or a better sausage for a lower price. And it is because of, I mean, using Smith's own argument, it is because of that self-interest, the incentives at play, that capitalism is consistently able to provide better goods for lower prices. And this is another thing. Yeah, and
while I generally agree, it seems to me, just for the, when considering this particular argument, that what you're complaining about are the incentives that drive socialism. That there's this thing that other people have, and I want to have it too. It seems to me that that a similar incentive is what drives capitalism, even if the manner in which they play out is very different.
Well, I mean, so capitalism says as long as you've got the money to pay for some bread, you're entitled to some bread. As long as you trump up the cash, the baker is obligated to give you some bread in exchange for the money.
Yeah.
Whereas socialism just says baker's oven.
Yeah, I would say that the capitalist, you would say, works for his money, for his goods, and the socialists, I think, what you're saying is wants it without work, or wants it without earning it.
The socialists' habit is to say bread is a human right, so give me some.
Yes, well, that's the question here. Don't you think that there's a certain level of human rights that people can demand? I mean, we talked today about healthcare, but I mean, you go back to the 19th century, yes, to the early days of the Industrial Revolution or capitalism, and you talk about a situation where people would be working like 14 hours a day, I think, for 7 days a week, from when they were 10 years old until they died of early age, with no vacation, no pension, no social security, no insurance. So no rights. Basically, just it was like slavery, and I think socialism then was necessary to basically give people a life, which admittedly there wasn't much leisure back then, which people could do with their time, but I think that if you work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the rest of the time you basically sleep, then, as Marx would say, you are alienated to your humanity.
Well, I mean, part of the issue here is that this picture that you're painting of the 19th century worker is kind of the product of years of leftist propaganda, for a start. I mean, let's just follow the incentives for a second. If you follow what people actually did from the 16th century to the 19th century, let's say, millions of people gravitated from the rural areas and the small villages to the cities, and they did that of their own volition. Nobody forced them. They went to places like London and Manchester and so on and so forth, because their wages were 90% higher in the cities than they were elsewhere. So it's always like, compared to what? The life of a 19th century worker, our mind goes immediately to Charles Dickens and, A Tale of Two Cities and things like that. But he's looking at the people who are at the very worst off. As an average, your 19th century Victorian labourer had a life of Riley compared to your 15th century peasant who was still on the feudal village. So I mean, there is a disturbing tendency that I've seen among socialists to almost romanticize the era of serfdom or the era of peasantry, because in some ways the peasants, even though they were chained to the land, did have a little more time to themselves because they split up their time in that way. But I would say in real terms, people had it better off when they were the workers.
It's very unusual to me that later stages of history, that socialists would consider later stages of history to be worse than earlier stages one, because at least within the Marxist framework, as much as they may despise capitalism, they would still generally concede that it's an improvement over feudalism and itself an improvement over whatever came before.
Yes, no, basically Marxists believe that there was improvement with capitalism, but then, as Agent said, things have been going back because of relative poverty, because the rich are getting richer. So because Marx, the way he, for Marx, Marx measures freedom by how much you work, how much is your labor worth compared to how much you make, right? So if you're not making as much as your labor is producing, then you're not free, then you're a slave. And the claim is, the Marxist claim, that this has gone down, that you are making now, your labor has produced enormous wealth now in the West, but you are making relatively less. That's the claim, which I think is stupid. But
he breaks it all down into time. So I mean, I don't want to get into the labor theory of value, and long-time followers of mine will have a little chuckle about that. But essentially, he works out how much time in the day is the worker working for themselves, and how much is he essentially giving for free to the capitalist.
Yeah.
And I think I can't remember the exact formulation, but if it's more than like a half of your day, you're being exploited, essentially. Ideally, you'd be working 100% for yourself and not for your...
Libertarians might agree.
No, the thing is, Marx...
I would...
Yeah. Marx never brought into the equation the work of the capitalist, of the employer, which I think works. He works much harder than the employee. At least in my, I never wanted to be an employer because I think that's too much hassle. You basically work. It's a 24/7 thing to be an employer. As an employee, I just work my 8 hours and then go home.
This may be a good segue into something that we hear very frequently, especially from a socialist crowd, that is the wages of the CEO in comparison to the workers.
Yep.
Perhaps we could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, the way people who are on my side of the argument tend to justify wages would be in terms of the workers' productivity. Workers are paid by how productive they are, and productivity. So the CEO is a very productive member of society because he is providing lots of people with jobs, a net contribution to the entire system, and therefore his remuneration is X amount of times more than the individual worker. And I mean, how can we work? Example I'd give is somebody like I don't know, Adele. You know, Adele singer.
Adele, yeah.
Now Adele makes a lot of money, and you could say, well, it's disgusting that Adele makes so much money. But then you could say, well, how many people are employed directly as a result of Adele existing as a product? How many people have marketing jobs? How many factory employees making the individual CDs and DVDs have a job because of her? And it will be many more times than, you know, the person who's... It'll be many more times the individual worker who is basically replaceable, and therefore can only command a much smaller salary. Whereas Adele is much more difficult to replace because she's Adele. And this is what it boils down to. Do you have any objections to that?
I think it's interesting how you can arrive at such different conclusions when you consider it in terms of productivity versus labor theory.
Yeah, well, I mean, the labor theory of value does not take knowledge into account. Most people aren't paid for the amount of time or effort that they spend.
Yeah.
They are paid for what they know And the analogy, the thing I always remember, my dad is an engineer. And when I was a kid, he, as well as working for where he usually works, he used to go out and kind of do like side contracts for, he'd like go and visit a factory for an hour or so. They had some problem with a machine, and then they just give him a one-off check. It was kind of like a side. He used to call them hobbles or hobbling. um, and I remember once he showed me the check, and it was for, I can't remember what it was for, 500 quid, £1,000, something like that. And he said, "Son, remember this. You're paid for what you know. I was only there for half an hour, but I knew this, and nobody else in that factory did. That's why I've got this check." And that is basically how capitalism. That's how capitalism remunerates its workers. It is why a McDonald's minion who is ultimately replaceable. I worked at McDonald's. You could literally train a child of 16, because they do it all the time, to make a Big Mac. I mean, it's a process that you don't have to think about at all. So that's so the supply of possible people to work at McDonald's is very big. And, the demand is quite large as well. And, it works out around whatever the minimum wage is. Whereas the amount of people who know how to, I don't know, code BASIC, or the amount of people who can code directly onto a silicone chip on a super low latency computer using high frequency trading, well, that's an incredibly niche area. There's about, yes, 24 people in the world who can do it, or however many it is. They're going to come on much larger salaries. Yeah. That's all it boils down to.
Yeah, Marx basically speaks of all workers as if they're McDonald's workers. It's all as far as I can see when I read him. It's like the knowledge doesn't even play a thing. It's like everybody is replaceable, and it's just about the amount of work you're doing. And I don't know how much it was true for industries in the 19th century. It was those simple things that you would do one thing that you could learn. But I'm sure already you had the industries that required knowledge.
Well, I mean, look at the Soviets. They hired more American and British experts in management, in finance, in engineering, because Lenin, once he was actually in power, was like, "Oh, holy shit, we need something more than just factory workers." It's actually quite difficult to run a factory. I mean, to be fair to Marx, he does recognize this, but he makes this bizarre move of breaking everything down into unskilled labor points. It's almost like it's such an abstraction. What Marx does is such an abstraction from how the real world works, that, I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer that it doesn't work once you start to try to apply it to the real world, because obviously in the real world there is such a thing as skilled labor, and you can't just break it all down by number of unskilled labor points, or however he manages to work it out. So
we have a name for this in physics. We call it the spherical cow approximation. You ever heard of it?
No. Why didn't you give to us what it is?
Well, a little anecdote goes that a physicist is going into the country, and he comes across a farmer, and he and the farmer start to chat. And the farmer tells him about some problem he's having with the cows. Says that there's some issue with milk in the cow, and he's trying to figure out how to fix this problem. And the physicist replies, "Oh, well, let's think of an ideal system. Let's approximate the cow as being shaped spherically." And the point is basically, frequently physicists will take very complex systems and try to reduce them to kind of their bare minimum, and then sort of add on more and more features to it in order, change the boundary conditions a little bit, make these tweaks, make those tweaks, and eventually you get what started out as a very simple base equation into something much more complicated. But there's a danger sometimes of starting out too basic, hence the spherical cow. That kind of sounds like what Marx was doing. He was yeah.
Well, and I do. I mean, generally speaking, I don't like going into biography or autobiography of various philosophers. But in Marx's case, it really is important because here's a man who spent his, all his work writing about the workers. He never met a worker. His friend Engels owned a factory, and he didn't once visit that factory. So he never had any experience of real world industry at all.
Well, he was anointed.
He was an anointed guy sitting in his office in London, basically trying to figure out the plight of the working man without ever having even met one. And he wouldn't. He actually refused. He wouldn't. He was very snobbish. So I don't know. You can tell a lot about Marx's basic is if you look at his life biography. He was horrible. He wasn't a very nice person at all. He spent his entire life loafing off his friend Engels, without whom he would have starved. So is it any wonder that he devises a system where you have a ton of freeloaders?
Yeah, I think most Marxists are basically a bourgeoisie who are speaking in the name of the working class and basically using them as pawns in this revolutionary dream.
Have you ever read Antonio Gramsci?
No, I intend to though.
You've mentioned him a few times.
Yeah, Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who was he was captured by Mussolini in the 1930s. As you can imagine, Mussolini, despite having socialist roots himself, in the end wasn't that keen on the socialists.
Yeah.
And he had Gramsci imprisoned. And when he was in prison, he basically planned all his, he did a lot of political planning as to how the revolution might come about. And his famous work is the Prison Notebooks.
Yeah.
And in there, he says very explicitly that the intellectuals are the people who run society, and lays out basically how the working man, how the proletariat needs to be more or less tricked into the revolution. I mean, he actually makes some quite decent points in there, if I want to be fair to Gramsci. Like, for example, at one point he says that the working man, the proletariat, does not understand the state. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand the state is too much of an abstraction for him to get his head around. He also doesn't understand how the government might relate to his life. But what he does understand is how much he hates his own line manager, or how much he hates the foreman.
Yes.
This is the sort of, and to an extent he's right. Like, I mean, I don't want to be too disparaging about the working man, but to an extent we can see this even today. Your typical like Sean Hannity fan in America, or like they don't, or I don't know, like your stereotypical Trump voter doesn't necessarily understand like the of how all of this stuff works, but they do understand that this guy's saying he's going to give me a job. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the transformation that happened in Marxism, because for Marx it was all just a historical inevitability, and you didn't have to teach people anything; it would just happen because of the march of history that will make will eventually make the proletariat rise, rebellion, and then they realized that basically it's not going to happen. And then they started to think that you have to trick the. So instead of saying Marx was wrong, they started thinking, okay, how can we rape reality and make it fit with what Marx prophesized? And
this is really where your cultural Marxism comes from. It's from your Frankfurt School and so on. And in some, this is maybe something we can talk about. To an extent, I actually wonder if they've been quite successful in mining people's faith in their own governments and their own system. I mean, we're obviously going through a crisis in the West now. Do anyone have any thought? I mean, if you listen to people from the right, universities, and Stefan, for them, the apocalypse is coming. They think that, even Jordan Peterson is a bit like this.
Yes.
Thinking that they would somewhat overstate the case, but I do see some aspect of what they're saying. What do you guys think?
I think it's just, I think I've said it before, it's just a phase. We have those phases. We had such a phase in the late 60s, early 70s, where this kind of Marxism gets into vogue, and then it just eats itself out. And the only question is, how many people will die before this happens? Because, you had all the terrorism in the 70s and all that. So it's going to eat itself out, but we need to defeat it as fast as possible, because people will die until it. So that's the way I see it. I'm not afraid that it will take over. It's not.
I've actually recently been watching that. It's a fantastic documentary series, the Vietnam War one, made by Ken Burns. And what was really interesting to me, seeing like the footage of the May '68 riots and all of the activism around the Vietnam War and the radicalization of students all across the West. It actually made me think about now in relation to then. And in some ways, I wonder if all we're seeing, to get terribly postmodern, is a pale imitation of 60s radicalism now, or whether there is actually something more to it. I actually wonder if what we're seeing is, I guess, a performance, like, the 60s is romanticized in a way. And that form of student protest has been romanticized by the left and by culture in general for,
Yes.
going on 40 odd years now. So our kids now just kind of performing what they think they should be doing in some way.
Yes, I'm happy you articulated this, because this has been rolling through my head a lot. But I thought, it was just too uncharitable to say out loud. Here's a point Marx may have been correct on. History repeats itself twice. The second time is farce.
I've said it before, that what the SJWs are Marxism returning as a farce. And look, I'm making my series on psychedelia, on the 60s, and one of the reasons I'm doing it is to show that it happened before, and I think that definitely has an effect on what is happening today. I think people who because it failed, that they're trying again, but and yes, there is a certain degree of romanticization, which the thing is, they're romanticizing the wrong thing. The great thing about the 60s wasn't the student revolution. It was basically pop culture. It was it's the hippies were not the hippies and the students were two different groups. And all the other cultural things that happened in the 60s, and there was a bit of a crossover, but in a large way, what the students basically destroyed the 60s. To me, this left-wing radical left, to me, destroyed the 60s.
How did they do that?
Basically took it in a direction of basically made it Marxism, made it you look at John Lennon just falling back into Marxism in the beginning of the 70s. And
I think one of the things that one of the things that's often forgotten as well is the tail of this. I mean, these were pretty radical in the universities. I was reading E.O. Wilson's book on human nature, and it's basically the 2004 second edition of that book, or the anniversary edition of that book. And he's got a preface in this where he's writing in 2004, looking back on back in 1978. And his books, Sociobiology in 1975 and On Human Nature in 1978, the Marxists tried to shut that down. I mean, we talk about no platforming now. They tried to get E.O. Wilson blacklisted, like from, and he says in the book, the flavor in the air at the time was radical left. All of the people in the university supported the Soviet Union at that time.
Yeah.
So they were rabidly anti-science in the 70s, and that is kind of forgotten now because the left do a very good job of covering up their tracks or conveniently forgetting what twats they were. And this happens time and again.
Yeah, but look, I see it as a pendulum. You know, the right that time when the left goes too much to the left, then they basically destroy themselves, and then the right wing rises, and then the right becomes idiotic and you know, too religious and all that, and the left I mean, the left was much more reasonable in the say 80s and 90s. You know, when they basically put the radicals aside, and you had reasonable people, and now it returns because the left was successful in its basically in the identity politics, which became the flag since the 60s of basically the reasonable left. The reasonable left was about identity from the 60s to to the last decade, I think, and then it was taken over by the Marxists. They took over identity politics and made it stupid.
This sounds a lot like Hegel.
One of the interesting things, I've been watching on and off for the past month or couple of months. I've been watching Fox News. I watch Tucker Carlson, and occasionally I watch Sean Hannity. Crock, you have access to Fox there. They actually stopped it in this country, believe it or not.
What?
They have stopped Fox being shown. Sky said they just weren't getting enough viewers, but I think it's something. I think it's something to do with the fact that Rupert Murdoch is trying to buy Sky, and they don't want that to happen. And so obviously one of the ways they can get at him is by stopping Fox being shown. But anyway, I've been watching it on YouTube. But one of the things I've noticed about the rhetoric coming from the Trump right at the moment, which is obviously very nationalist, but if you listen to Sean Hannity talk, he talks, how can I put this? There's something of leftism in Sean Hannity. I know it sounds insane, but he's constantly talking about the elites and the working man and how people in this country are getting screwed over by the corporations. And so there's an element of the Trump right, which is almost like a kind of echo of the left of the 70s and the 80s. It sounds like really bizarre, but
the lines are not just redrawn. It's scribbled all over the place, and we don't know what the hell the picture looks like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very strong pro-worker aspect of the Trump movement that is not right wing the way that it's not conventionally right wing. They're very protectionist. They're very obviously they're but it's not like they are adverse to. This is the phrase I'm looking for. Sean Hannity, if you listen to him, sounds like he's waging a class war of the working man against the elites.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think that sounds well. I think he might want to at least give the perception that that's what's going on. You know, Republicans really like to get in touch with at least the white working class, and they have long desired the non-white working class as well. So I don't know what to make of that.
Have you seen that guy who was recently won the Republican primary in Alabama? A guy called Roy Moore.
No.
Have you seen it? He's basically a guy in a cowboy hat. And I swear to God, if you think Trump is bad or outrageous or bombastic, that guy, I mean, he gets on stage and he's basically quoting chapter and verse from the Bible and is, I mean, borderline what you'd imagine a guy in a cowboy hat from Alabama to say, like the absolute stereotype of it. And I wonder if old Steve Bannon gets his way in America, and gets people like that, basically replaces the old GOP with those sorts of candidates, whether what Zarathustra is saying about the right going insane again may come to fruition. Because if the GOP becomes then, America is basically trapped between essentially insane SJW Marxists on the left, which is seemingly where the Democrats seem to be going, and people who really shouldn't be in politics on the right. You know, people who in any other time would not be considered fit for office in any other way.
Well,
is this a cause of concern for you?
the way I see it, most people are still reasonable. So when the left or the right goes crazy, they just go to the other side, and the other side becomes reasonable. The reason why I mean, look, in the beginning of this decade, it looked like the right is going crazy with you know, that in taking no, not actually, no, before that, that the religious right has been in the Bush years. It seemed that the religious right was controlling America, and I'm talking religious, you know, evangelist, and basically they alienated a lot of people from the GOP, and they voted Obama, they voted Democrat, and the Democrats won and became powerful, and then you know, the left became crazy. So people I remember that years ago I said, well, what will happen to the Republicans, because everybody's leaving them, and only the evangelists will remain. But what happened was that because the left went crazy, the reasonable people started to go back to the Republicans, and now you see now you see the evangelists not so strong, because there are other people in the Republican Party now. So I'm not so much afraid of this polarization where everybody goes crazy, because I think most people are still reasonable, and that's not going to change. They're just going to basically, when one camp goes crazy, they're going to vote for the other camp, and if both parties go crazy, they'll vote for someone else.
Any thoughts? I mean, what if you think? What do you think is going to happen? You're in California, right?
Yes. I honestly don't know. You know, I'm inclined to agree with Zarathustra here. I've made
Sorry,
similar.
I'll say that again. You're in California.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Agent?
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, I am in California.
Yeah. So I mean, what are your basic options now as a voter there? What I mean, are you just trapped in kind of complete socialist hell?
Well, I mean, you know, it depends on the part of California you're in. You know, even you go toward San Francisco, it's a very different place than, say, Irvine. Irvine's in Orange County. That's sort of a conservative area in California. And then in between the two, you have Los Angeles, and that's kind of a sort of mix. It's hard to describe Los Angeles. Well, I mean, but statewide, of course, you know, when it comes to voting, it doesn't really matter what you vote. You could vote for Kanye West. The state is still going blue.
I guess one of the things that we should talk about, and maybe I'll run through because we got through two of my points, but one of the things I guess we should do is define our terms. As in, what do we mean by socialist? Do you, the two of you, consider Barack Obama a socialist?
No.
Okay, I'll say it. So when I talk about, look, in the 90s, it basically seemed like after the fall of the Soviet Union, when people call themselves socialists, they no longer meant something that is different from capitalism. They basically meant we accept that the capitalism won. We are in a market, a free market, democracy, and socialism is just the counter that safeguards against capitalism going crazy, this is what I always understood. So, and a lot of people who call themselves socialists, that is what they mean. And it's just lately that socialism, hard socialism, has returned. That now it again it means something that is anti-democratic and anti-capitalist.
So
and to me,
essentially what we're talking about is a social democrat. Some people would
yes,
say,
Yeah.
and to me the
alien style.
socialist, the anti-democrat socialist is to me irrelevant and just stupid. But what I was asking, if socialism has merit, does social democracy has merit today? And I mean, for a while, if you go back a few years, it seemed like the left started to talk in the name of the middle class, not the working class. The middle class is shrinking, and because capitalism is becoming this only for the 1%, the middle class is shrinking, and so we need to do something against this process to reverse this process where the middle class is shrinking. And that was what the left was about a few years ago. Before, basically, you had this, Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, and I think Bernie Sanders is still about that in large part.
But if you listen to Sean Hannity, that's what he's about. That's the rhetoric that he talks about
Yes,
now.
that's
The
what I
shrinking middle
thought.
class.
Maybe they took over that the right now because the left has gone back to working class and to this more hard thing, that maybe the right is now taking over this thing about the middle class again, that is being.
But what's really interesting here is that the core support of Corbyn or of Bernie Sanders are middle class people.
Yes,
If you look at who actually voted for Corbyn, they were all university students. They were, the intelligentsia, what I like to call the virtue signaling classes. Now it's hard to. I mean, it's in a way it's difficult to pass that last election because there are mitigating factors. One, Theresa May ran a terrible election. Two, she turned her back on some of her core constituencies, her core voters, the old people, for example. But even though he talks about the many, for the many, not the few, if you look at his policy suite, it is actually geared towards helping out middle class people. He's for free tuition fees, for example, for people to go to university. That's basically levying a tax on poor people so that middle class kids can go to university, if you think about it. He's for, he was against what Theresa May was calling a dementia tax. If you actually look into the economics of that, that is levying a tax on young people now to ensure that people who already have a house don't have to pay extra money if they get sick. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of the actual policies that he's bringing in aren't helping the poor; they're helping the middle class.
So what do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that the claim that the middle class is shrinking, and it's not a good thing? It's not a good thing that the middle class is shrinking. Capitalism is basically built on middle class. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think maybe Agent will probably clarify, but it seems to me that it's the categories that are shrinking, but not necessarily the amount of flesh and blood people within these bins, within these categories.
Well, I don't understand how anybody can claim middle class is shrinking when if you look in 1960 and 1970, 2 to 10% of the population went to university, and now 35 to 40% of the population goes to university. How can you say the middle class is shrinking?
Yeah.
In 1945, 50% of the country were coal miners and factory workers. Now, at least 40% of the country work in the city doing jobs like marketing and PR.
I think when we talk about shrinking, we're
Brexit.
talking about the last 20 years. That's the thing. I think that's the claim.
What do they mean then? Like how shrinking when?
I mean, the other thing that I point out is that in that time, hundreds of millions of people have gone from working class to middle class in China and India and all those. So middle class is growing globally. But okay, so let's say we're talking about only the Western economies. So you're saying so what is it based on then? I'm not very much into economy. What is the claim based on that the middle class is shrinking?
I think it's based on the idea that real wages have not kept up with the rate of inflation.
Yeah.
So the high school teacher is earning less now than they were 10 years ago in real terms. But obviously they don't factor in other things into those calculations, like the real costs of living, for example. How much does a loaf of bread cost now in real terms versus in 1990? It's less now than it was then, but nobody ever factors in those things. They just look at so many of the arguments from that side of things are based on kind of abstract statistics as opposed to the real world. And then it kind of carries weight with people because they have a few what they call gotcha statistics. That carries the day. I mean, what we're really meant to believe that people who have iPhones and iPads and so on and so forth have a harder life today than people who were working for a Ford factory in 1952.
Yeah,
you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, I'm not buying it at all.
However, there is probably something deeper to all of this, which is that, I mean, my mother grew up in a working class coal mining town in the valleys of Wales, okay? And she says her feeling is that people had a greater sense of community. And even though they had nothing, they'd buy a joint of meat and it would have to last them the week. You know, these people were poor, dirt poor, but they felt like they knew everybody in their local town. They were part of, a real living community where you knew the butcher and the baker and everybody knew each other on first term names walking down the street. People would live and die in the same place. And that's an old way of life. And there are lots of people, and I think these are the people who drove the Trump and the Brexit votes, who feel that the global capitalism, i.e. cheap products made in China, which is ultimately what most of our stuff is, and unlimited consumer choice, hasn't filled that hole. It doesn't make you happy. And on those grounds, I would say that some of these people, even socialists, may have a point that, Milton Friedman and capitalism gives you some of the answers. It's a great way of getting cheap products and unlimited choice. But is that what human beings ultimately want? Or, is that what we need? Can you replace the church with, the Beatles and, a choice of 10 DVDs and cheap food? I don't know. But that's a deep question. And I think ultimately our problems come down to that sense of a loss of community. But that's not an economics problem. That's a culture problem.
And which will not be solved with socialism.
No, it won't. And I also, I hate to say it, Trump fans, I also don't think it will be solved by somebody like a Donald Trump trying to turn back the clock
Yeah,
and artificially bring back the factories. That's not going to work either.
yeah. Let's go back just a minute to something we just touched upon in the beginning. Do you think that there is a certain level of human rights that people can demand? Things like, I mean, the thing that happened to me is that capitalism has internalized the things that the socialists were demanding in the 19th century. Capitalism realized that it is better to have no child labor and instead send the children to school, and that it is good to give the workers vacations and insurance and pension and all that capitalism actually works better. And those are things that socialism demanded. So it's basically internalized some of the demands of socialism, those that were good. And so do you think that there is this level of rights, of things that we should consider as human rights, which capitalism should not be able to the capitalism must guarantee, even if it's not profitable?
Yeah. See, my answer is yes and no. As in, the trouble with the language of rights is that it's a slippery slope. That is, what was yesterday's privilege becomes today's rights. So if you look at how the language of rights have shifted over time, yes, I would agree that slavery is a bad thing and that it is a human right to be free, to be your own person and not to be the property of some other person. A good right. It is probably a human right. What are some other? Name me some good human rights. Name me what are some of the operation that you two would assent to them. I just can't think of any at the minute.
Well, let's talk about healthcare.
So, is it a human right not to get treatment if you get sick, for example?
Yes, but the question is it is a human right to have insurance, to have to be treated, and someone and the state will pay for it, or so that you it will not you will not be broke because you got sick.
I don't know if that's a right. I don't know if it's a right. I mean, it's something that we enjoy, living in a nice country.
I have a better question. Is it useful?
Yeah.
Useful for what?
Do you want
Is it useful to the greatest number of people?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you can definitely justify it on utilitarian grounds.
Yeah.
That it is better to have a system that looks after people than leaves them to die in the street.
I think it may be better to consider it in those terms than a kind of transcendent, do we have a duty to provide this? Well, I mean, do we have a duty to fund scientific projects? No, but it's useful. It helps us live longer. It helps makes our lives easier and more convenient. So why not?
So like I said, that capitalism internalized things that socialism demanded. When basically they realized it is utilitarian. It is utilitarian to send the children to school and not to have them working in the factories.
But now we've shifted from the language of universal rights to essentially a consequentialist utilitarian argument. The issue I have with rights is how much it gets pushed. Like, for example, is it a human right to own your own house?
I would like it to be a human right. I don't think it is realistic right now.
Because the argument that it is a human right to own your own house led to our 2008 crisis directly. I mean, if you follow the legislation back, all of that started because people were like, "Why are banks turning down black people for mortgages?" Um, and people like Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, and various other people in the Democrat Party were like, "This is wrong. Banks are being racist." Now they never asked, "Well, should these people be lent money to get mortgages?" It is no. It is a right for these people to get mortgages, and it led to one of the worst economic crises we've seen well, the worst one that we've seen in our lifetime, but also the worst crisis for the last 100 years. And
I think I agree with you, Agent, when it comes to you speaking in the language of rights. I think the problem it's slippery because there's no really foundation. There's no we don't really talk about how we identify human rights, what distinguishes a right from a privilege. What exactly is a right? How do we know when we see it?
Is it a human right to get a sex change if you want one? I mean, these you see the left constantly push it. The language of rights allows the left to push. Like, let's just pretend everybody was given a house somehow. Okay, everybody in the entire country was given a house through forcible redistribution or any other. How long before somebody comes along and says, "Well, hold on, those two people over there have got a swimming pool. It's a human right to have a swimming pool." Do you understand where I'm going with this? I mean,
yeah.
And that is how human rights has gone since it was. If you go back to the debates between people like Edmund Burke and Rousseau back in the Enlightenment era, Edmund Burke basically he rejects human rights altogether on this basis, on the basis that it's a nonsense to speak of rights, quote unquote, because where does it end? Who decides what's a right? And I haven't actually fully made up my mind about that because I recognize that some of the rights that we've brought in are actually very good, like the rights of everybody to vote, for example.
But hold on. I think I personally I think I tend to lean more consequentialist when it comes to these kinds of questions. I think the reason why we ultimately support some rights and why we don't think owning a swimming pool is a right is because we make a cost benefit calculation. What's ultimately going to benefit the greatest number of people.
There's another way of looking at it. I was reading, there's actually somebody who's interesting to read on this. He has a book called The Descent of Man. Either of you guys read that?
Darwin?
Darwin, yeah.
Yeah,
Descent
yeah,
of Man. In The Descent of Man, he's got this really interesting passage where he talks about how the most civilized societies are the ones who look after their weakest members. Like he talks about the imbecile, like the people who are mentally ill, basically. He was saying, well, in his Victorian society, they'd already got to the point of having mental asylums and institutions, and that they weren't going to let people who had serious conditions just kind of crash and burn. Do you know what I mean? Like there was some help provided to them. In those days, it was done by individual charity and philanthropists as opposed to the state. But he was saying, like, this is one mark. This is how we can tell that the British are civilized, whereas some of these Native American tribes I'm seeing, they were still eating each other. I mean, I'm being very crude, but this is essentially what he says. Or look at how they treat their women. Now, they didn't have votes for women in Darwin's day, but like the life of the average woman in England was better than the life of the average woman in an African tribe where they were doing, female genital mutilation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that argument? The kind of how civilized do we want to be? So rather than talking about rights, talking about the mark of civilization. Any thoughts on that?
I tend more towards that, towards just determining what we can give to everyone, and basing our rights on this. Because okay, we can't give a house to we can't give a house to everyone to own a house, but we can provide shelter for everyone. Yeah. And in the future, so anyone who is homeless, we can create shelters for them to go when there is bad weather or something. And I think that in the future, when houses will be very cheap to make, then we can give a house to everyone. Just the question is, what can we do? What are we capable of doing, and determining rights based on that? Because, like you said, there is no philosophical way to determine what a human right is.
Well, I still think it's all ultimately tied to consequences. If you take, for example, this talk of imbeciles and homeless people in Darwin's day and even to this day, could there be a net social benefit, both socially and economically, to putting these people in homes or inside of asylums or whatever? Does the number of, because at Santa Barbara, for instance, where I went to university, the entire town is full of homeless people and mentally ill people, people who are abusing some kind of substance, people who have some kind of defect, and you can sort of just see them muttering to themselves in the street corner all day, and they angry, kind of scary people on the bus, sort of just everybody's trying to avoid eye contact with this one weird dude who's talking to himself. They're all over the place, and let's say you did build a home for them to all go to, and you had caretakers or whatever. Would the cost of this home of taking care of these people possibly be less than the cost of for instance, the property, property values where they're loitering going down because they're loitering there, of the values of the buses, those things being devalued, the trips on the buses being devalued as a consequence of these people's presence there. I think ultimately there is, we do have to talk about social costs and economic costs.
Well, in the 50s, they were all in asylums.
Well, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about let's just lobotomize everybody. I'm saying give them a home, give them some caretakers. There's a lot of unemployed psychology students. There's surely there's some solution. Well, not solution, but acceptable trade-off that can take place here.
Yeah, I think that that it was wrong to just send everybody to the street, which is what happened in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And in a large part, it was for philosophical reasons. It was existentialist psychologists who just said that we don't have the right to call someone crazy.
Foucault.
No, not Foucault. It's not Foucault. It's Foucault was just starting out back then. The movement was existentialist, not postmodern. This whole opening the asylum, but it was also because the asylums overreached. Just everyone was sent there. Everyone was a bit, everyone was homosexual, and everyone who, I mean, women who were too over sexualized and all that. So it became this place where in the 50s, everyone who didn't conform was sent there. So yeah, but and that's what was one reason why there was this rebellion against it. But
Can I ask a question though to Crock?
Yeah.
Sure.
So, see, the consequentialist argument can be tricky as well. I can very well imagine Machiavelli sitting here and saying, "Let's just pretend we know what to do with these people," and he says, "Well, weigh everything up. Let's just kill them."
Or,
let's just get rid of them.
In the spirit of inquiry, I'll play along.
Yeah. So, what do you say to what are the costs of just eradicating these people? This is what Stalin would do.
Yeah. Well, you now have a very angry and very scared populace who's going to be less productive, and who might end up plotting and rebelling against the state.
So you think that the people would see this as tyranny, and that's enough of a cost to not do it?
Yeah.
Essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Human rights, the right to life, I think, is a right that should be enshrined, and so you can't just kill someone for being crazy.
Everybody has a right to life.
Yeah.
But I think we have a right to life because it's useful to have a right to life. Otherwise, people are not going to, they're not going to agree to the social contract. They're not going to want to be part of the state.
I would rather rephrase it actually in Isaiah Berlin's terms. It's not that we have a right to life; it's that we have a right. We have a right to live without somebody coming along and killing us. We have a freedom from undo incarceration, undo harm coming to us because of violence. So I'd rather phrase it in the negative liberty way than in the positive liberty way.
Okay.
I don't know if it makes a difference, but maybe rights make more sense if you do it in terms of what you're allowed to be free from. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, I have to think about it a little bit, but I get what you're saying. Yeah.
I feel like you could play semantic games with that, though. I mean, let's take healthcare, for instance. A person, the positive liberty person will say everyone has a right to healthcare. The negative liberty person could say essentially the same thing. They could say we have a right from untreated illness.
No, the right is the right to be defended from diseases and illnesses and things like that.
But the outcome is basically the same, isn't it?
Well, the hardcore libertarians argue against things like Obamacare on the basis of, hold on a second, surely I've got a choice not to have healthcare if I don't want to. It's my choice to get ill and die if I want to. What do you say about that? That the hardcore libertarian rights in America oppose universal healthcare or Obamacare or mandated insurance on the grounds that shouldn't you respect the freedom of somebody to not allocate their resources in that way if they want to? I don't know what the answer to that is because I've always lived in
I actually think that on some level the state should enforce on people certain things which the people are not smart enough to know. You're not smart enough to understand. You're not a doctor, so you don't understand the consequences, and so in things where it's freedom from suffering, this is where I think that the state has the right to enforce things on people. You force people to, for instance, when it comes to electricity in the homes, to install protective, things like that. That people just don't understand electricity, so they won't do it if you don't force them to do it.
What about euthanasia, though? Let's say a person is suffering from a terminal illness and They have 2 weeks to live. They're guaranteed to die in 2 weeks. They're going to suffer the entire time. But they don't want to be euthanized. Under the principle that the government is going to minimize the suffering of people even against their own will, this person who wants to live for those next 2 weeks would have to be euthanized in order to minimize his suffering.
Well, that's, you're taking a radical case here.
Is it though, Rob? Is it though? I mean, aren't hospitals?
We've seen directly the opposite case here in the UK, where people who do want to euthanize themselves are told by the state that they're not allowed to.
Yeah.
Which has been the status quo for some time now in this country.
Right. Yeah, I disagree with that as well. Well, what I'm saying is to conceive it in terms of negative liberty may not necessarily work because of the kind of case I'm bringing up. If the government is going to do good to people in terms of what's going to minimize their suffering, I think this is the kind of consequence you might end up seeing. People probably won't accept it.
Yeah, and this is why some of the libertarians basically say, well, look, to protect freedom, we may have to take some harmful consequences, but that's the cost of freedom. That's the trade-off. Some people may want to make really stupid choices, but nobody else should be in a position to stop them if they want to. If you want to kill yourself through burgers and not getting health insurance, eat your heart out, basically. Why don't I go through some of the? I can't remember what my. We went through the first two. Should I wrap up the others? I can't remember what they are now. Let's see. I'm trying to remember. There was the lies. We covered the lies and the moral case.
Well, there was that it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. The philosopher kings.
Yeah.
The corruption. This was the Uber case in London was my example, but I could use many other examples. And the final one was trying to think now. The corruption, philosopher kings.
Talk about those.
Oh
three.
yeah. That it is always dictatorial. Ultimately, because it's top down as opposed to bottom up, millions of people making individual choices versus one person making a categorical decision on their behalf.
Would you say the same thing? The same things apply to social democracy, to social democracy.
Well, I mean, I would. I think the logic of, and I mean, you, there's no way of talking about this without getting into a little bit of economics. The likes of Barack Obama, he's not a Marxist. Oh, he is actually closer to being that than Democrats were before him. So he was further to the left than Bill Clinton was, for example. Actually, Keynesianism is all about essentially using economists to engineer the economy in such a way to reduce the risk of recession, to maximize jobs. So they are basically engineering the economy, the Keynesians. And Barack Obama, with all of his fiscal packages and so on, he did this. He was very Keynesian in the way that he approached the economic recovery after the 2008 crash. And the economists on the right argue that he shouldn't have done any of those things, that the recovery was slower than it needed to be, that that you cannot engineer the economy in that way. So, I mean, and again, I don't want to get into the weeds of it too much. Then you have a split on the right between people who say that you should actually control monetary policy, that is, how much money there is in the system. That's the old Milton Friedman way. And the people who are even more libertarian, who say actually you shouldn't intervene at all, and you'd make a faster recovery if you did nothing. if the government just didn't act, leave the banks collapse. Yes, you're going to take some short-term pain, but the recovery will be quicker. They usually point to the 1921 recovery, Calvin Coolidge. So, and I actually, that's the Hayek argument, and I lean towards that. But I'm realist enough to recognize that in a democracy where most people, most of the time, don't have any knowledge or care to know anything about economics, it's always easier to sell the idea that you're going to act than it is to sell the idea that you're going to do nothing. It's always in a politician's interest to say, I'm going to do something, than I'm going to do nothing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely makes sense. I think that's a big part of it, that you have to, if you're a capitalist, you always have to ask yourself, am I not asking the public something that goes against human nature? Like, if the rich get too rich, are the public going to rise up? Because human nature is to envy, to not to when some, even if you are getting better, like you say, even if the poor are actually getting better, if they see that the rich are getting richer faster, they're not going to be happy. So things like that you always have to bring into account, the psychology of money.
Well, to me, the great irony of this is that if you actually had a more laissez-faire system than one that continually tried to engineer it and continually tried to produce better outcomes all the time, you'd probably have a situation where this gap wasn't growing. This sounds counterintuitive, but I actually think that in America, certainly, and in this country, and in Europe, the reason that we're in the position that we are now is because of social democracy. And I don't know how much time we've got, but I can talk you through why I think that as well. Part of it is the corruption. You increase regulation. That means that you produce a creature. The system of social democracy produces a creature like Hillary Clinton. It produces a creature like Jean-Claude Juncker, or these technocrats. Because it is built on concentrating power into the expert class by its very nature. Because it's even though it's not Marxist socialism, it's still socialist in that broader sense of trusting in the intellectual elites to run things on behalf of the people because they know better. And in another way, by pushing up workers' wages through things like minimum wage, through regulation, through all of these various different rights, quote unquote, you make it much harder to compete when there are other countries like China, like India, like Brazil, say, who haven't either got to that point yet. So you essentially move the labor somewhere else. And it leads to other problems, like the problems that we're seeing now. It leads to Donald Trump. It leads to the rise of Corbyn. All of these things, in my view, have been produced by the perverted incentives of social democracy. A welfare state that is too robust, that is too all-encompassing, makes a country like France uncompetitive. It makes it, don't forget, earlier this year, we had a crypto-fascist almost became the president of France. That's France. And Emmanuel Macron ran, under the radar. He did it by virtue signaling and appealing to a form of basically making France less socialist. Quietly, by dismantling their, they will have a 4-day week in France. They have deliberately kept unemployment at a certain level. I think unemployment is pretty huge, like 10% plus in France. That's a deliberate economic policy in France to essentially game their productivity score. productivity is done on like how productive is each worker in work. Well, if you keep 10% of the population out of work, each worker is more productive, and they can, and that basically moves France. This is why France is fifth largest economy. It's been gained for the past 50, 60 years. And this is like good for GDP. It's good for the spreadsheets. Whether it's good for flesh and blood human beings is another question ultimately. And so I don't know. It's kind of we're getting into the weeds of things, but more or less where I am at the moment when it comes to social, like whatever you do, you cannot get around the economic reality of supply and demand. And I guess that it's the trade-off for the benefits that you were talking about, Zarathustra. Like in Sweden, for example, they had a policy of, well, isn't it disgusting that some people haven't got places to live? So what they did is that they basically instituted rent controls in Sweden. Okay, that meant that the cost of rent is going to be fixed at a really low rate. Well, what happens if you institute rent controls? More people suddenly want those apartments at low prices. And then in Sweden, they had systemic and endemic shortages for decades.
Well,
Did they solve it?
Even people who can afford better apartments?
Rent controls, more people are going to want those ones at a lower cost. So you drive up demand. The price can't move because you've categorically fixed it. So you get a shortage. I mean, that's what it doesn't increase the amount of housing.
What if
you've just carry on?
What if we reconceptualize the welfare state, not in terms of everybody has a right to this or that, but people, you orient the incentives in such a manner that it produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. Take housing, for example. You can say to somebody, okay, you can have this housing, but it's not charity. It's not coming to you. It is coming to you at the expense of the state, but this expense is not charity. It's an investment. And if you want to keep this house, you're going to have to go to work, and you're going to have to get paid, a particular amount. But you get to have this house in exchange, and people can contractually agree to this kind of arrangement. And this would be the nature of the welfare state, as opposed to just giving people free shit. Make it contingent upon how much they give back.
Yeah, well, that would be lovely. That would be better than what we have now. But just before I came on air, somebody sent me a tweet saying, in Britain at the moment, the Tories are trying to introduce this thing called universal credit. Have you heard of this? Essentially, what they've done is they've consolidated 6 different benefits that people used to receive into one payment. And somebody tweeted at me just before we came on air that there was somebody on the BBC who said, it's awful. Some people I know have had their benefits removed, and now they've been forced to go to work. So it's it's nice to think about, but it's very difficult if you're used to having something for free to get people to pay for it. It's really hard to go that way.
I think this might help with the cultural problem at the same time. I think, a lot of the meaning people lose. I have a few friends who they're basically NEETs. They're not educated, not in employment, not in training. What they do is they sit at home all day and they play video games. This is indelicate, but I know some guys from back in my high school days, and they're basically just neckbeards. They're munching on Doritos and drinking Mountain Dew, just sitting at home getting fat and mooching off of their parents. And then when their parents die, they're probably going to be mooching off of the state. And I've tried to help them. I've talked to them. You gotta get out of the basement. You gotta focus on yourself. You gotta develop yourself, because right now all this depression and misery and anxiety you're feeling right now, sitting at home not doing anything, it's a consequence of you just letting life pass you by, of you not being industrious and not not trying to achieve anything with your life. So I think, in a sense, it would be better for the national character and for the spirit of the people if this incentive policy I'm talking about was put into play. People who are used to sitting at home and not doing anything, they're depressed as hell. People don't want to live life sitting at home watching TV, playing video games, or chatting to the neighbor over the fence. They want to go out and be somebody and do something with their life, even if they're too afraid to pursue it. But if you sort of hold their feet to the fire with this kind of work or you get kicked out kind of welfare system, you do that, and maybe you can help mitigate some of the cultural problems we were discussing earlier. This kind of consumeristic nihilism.
The problem,
yeah, carry on.
With the work or you get kicked out. Some people, what if you're an inventor and you're thinking about something and it takes you years to create it, and so you're not working at this time. You are something like me, like a writer. Yeah, I was sitting at home and writing stuff and still trying to figure out ways how to make money out of it. So if you just force people to work, you're going to harm that. How are you going to prevent that?
Well, it's not necessarily forcing people to work. It's in exchange for this government subsidized. The government is not going to be able to hand out charity under the system. It's got to be an investment. People have to be able to give back. So the inventor and the writer, presumably, they have some kind of credentials. They may be able to secure a position, and if not, they could do something part-time to help sustain themselves.
That's what I do.
Yeah. But like I'm talking about the person who just sits at home and collects who collects checks, gets EBT, gets whatever, and they're thinking, these are my benefits. This is just how I'm going to live my life. I'm gonna sit at home and mooch. That's my decision. This is how the incentives are arranged. You rearrange those incentives. You give people enough help for them to get started, and then once they become more industrious and once they acquire the skills and experience necessary to move up and start to become truly independent and give back to the economy, this investment pays itself off. And at the same time, these people, they have meaning in their lives now. They're not just these nihilistic consumerist losers playing video games all day. Maybe you can kill a few birds with this particular stone.
But I mean, over here, you will not get just paid if you don't search for work. If you want to get unemployment, you have to show that you try to find work. You don't just get unemployment sitting at home.
There are a lot of loopholes in the system. The way it's set up in America, at least, a person can they can go to their local social security office, wait in line, a bunch of screaming, crying babies. So somebody's taking care of the family. Here's an immigrant family. They need some social security help. They're willing to work, make their way up, and become independent. And then you have this other person who's just not motivated, who isn't really sure what they want to do with their life, and they're just kind of stuck in this hole. And I know people like this. They're mooching off of their parents, not the state, but it's just a matter of time. And
they had this problem in Japan. Have you heard of that? The herbivore generation.
Yes.
Basically, young men who just had no interest in a career or anything. All they wanted to do is play video games and mooch around, and they were happy with that, and they just opted out. Basically,
they're not happy. They're miserable as hell, but they see no other alternative because they're stuck in this kind of hole. It's not that they're content with this kind of life. It's that they are too demotivated to seek out any alternative. But anyway, here in America, the way it works is you can go to this office and you can go up to the lady at the register and say, I can't work. I have a note from the doctor saying I have asthma, and I have barely any education, and I have anxiety, and I can't work at a register. I can't bag groceries. This and that, and all these different reasons. you can go to a nutritionist, pay a reasonably small fee, and get pills for, I don't know, for this problem or the other, with very little paperwork, just minimal bureaucratic bullshit, just enough to get on the books to get you whatever it is, whatever kind of benefit you need. And people take advantage of this in this country all the time.
Yeah, there's a very weird thing that's happened in America where I think the top 10% of people pay 70% of all the tax. 45% of the population are not in the tax system. I mean, it's kind of strange how that's happened. And yet there are still people saying that the people at the top are the ones who are. I mean, it seems completely inverse to me. It's almost like there's a there's a whole class of people who work to keep a bunch of other people living in the manner to which they have become accustomed.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, I don't know how to change. I mean, it's a very difficult thing because even now the Republicans are trying to do the tax reform, and they can't. And they've got a majority in both the houses. They can't even get it through. Or they passed the budget the other day, but it was a struggle. So it's
The problem,
yeah.
the problem fundamentally isn't really the taxes. The taxes play a role, but what it really comes down to is the incentives that the welfare state lays out. This is just my own personal, totally unprofessional assessment of the situation. The welfare state, as it's currently in its current manifestation, it incentivizes people to just mooch. And I'm not saying that all welfare or even most welfare people do this. I'm just saying that the system is set up in such a manner that this phenomenon is prevalent.
I actually agree with you, and I mean this may be controversial, but it's my opinion that this problem with the incentives and welfare is at the root of Europe's immigration crisis. For decades we've been told we need immigrants to come to this country to do the work, when there are loads of perfectly able people exactly in this boat that you're talking about, but we're told, no, actually we need a Polish person or somebody from Turkey or whoever to come here and do those jobs because those people aren't willing to do it because they're not incentivized. And you have the same thing there. Instead of being Polish people, there it's Mexicans, right?
Yeah, my friends, these friends I'm talking about, the neckbeard ones, they're predominantly white. They don't want to, work at a gas station, even though that's kind of all they're qualified for. These are jobs they maybe, but the immigrants, they come here and they see, they come here because well, maybe it's different here than it is from Europe, but a lot of them come here. They really are very hard workers. They try.
No, it's
To
the
do.
same here. I mean, the people from Eastern Europe, the most of the migrants who come here are very hardworking to work. Unlike these people that you're talking about, and unlike the millions of people here who are on various different welfare benefits who haven't worked their entire lives. We're consistently told that for whatever reason they can't do these jobs or they're not willing to. Hundreds and thousands of people from outside. It's bizarre how that's happened. I actually put the blame partly on the likes of a Tony Blair, that the neoliberal consensus that grew up after the 1980, after Thatcher and Reagan. There was this kind of hybrid, the Bill Clinton, Tony Blair third way, which conventionally is more where my politics up until. One of the mistakes they made was in pushing education and university so hard. They produced this this kind of social wisdom that you have to look down on work that isn't basically white collar. Any jobs that you don't need a degree for are to be disdained and looked down upon. And this is essentially what the neckbeards are doing. They're looking down on work. They're looking down on those sorts of jobs. They feel entitled to something better, even though they're not qualified for anything better. essentially. Is this what you're saying, Crock?
Yeah.
Sometimes
So,
awkward.
and sometimes they are qualified. But I mean, my advice. I mean, if there's any young people, advice is that you have to have humility. You just have to swallow your pride at some point. You know, I was a few years ago, before I was an academic. I had a PhD. I'd been to Oxford, and I needed to get some money, and I just went. I worked. I started on, what was it, 18K in the first instance, and it was stuff that was, if I wanted to be like that, I could have said, well, this is miles beneath. I'm a much higher caliber. I shouldn't be doing this sort of work. But at the end of the day, you just got to swallow your own bullshit and just get on with it. And I mean, I guess you only get to learn that humility if you actually go into some of these menial jobs. I mean, I'm sure that when I worked at McDonald's when I was 16 and 17, and I was working alongside some of these people who might still be at McDonald's, those are the sorts of scenarios where you learn the type of humility necessary to get over yourself and actually just, go and work at a gas station or whatever it is. Might not be forever, but it's better than doing nothing, right?
I'd say that there is a problem with, what is your identity? What is it you want to do in life? Now, if the thing that you want to do in life is is something that makes you money, then you can go for it, and people do. But if you want to be like me, if you're passionate about things like philosophy and art and culture, then what you have to do is you have to just tell yourself that my worth is not in my work. I'll just work in things that will sustain me, and my identity is my identity that is outside of work. The things
that's a perfectly acceptable solution. I totally support that. When I'm talking about these neckbeard types, I'm talking about the people who are not passionate about anything. They just sit home and they play video games. And they make all kinds of excuses for why they're not going to go out and get a job, why they're not going to try, to commit themselves to anything really. Just sit at home, play games.
Yeah, well, that sounds pathetic. I don't know how to.
I don't imagine that you have very many of those in Israel. You have, the culture is very different. There's a.
Well, look, we had two large populations, who would make it was basically the Orthodox, the Orthodox, and the Arabs, who would exploit the welfare state to basically make babies into the job is to make babies. They would make like 8 children. They would get child support for all 8, and they would live off that. They would make a career out of that, and eventually the state said, okay, that's enough, and that happened about 15 years ago.
What were the consequences?
The child support has been reduced for after I think the 3rd or the 4th child, and with the Arabs it brought and we don't know how much of, because this is a process that's going on in the entire Arab world where the birth rate is going down, but surely it helped that the Arabs are I mean, the birth rate has gone down, and they are developing careers more now, and getting the financial situation is getting better. When it comes to the Orthodox Jews, that's a bigger problem, because for them it's ideological that they are supposed to procreate. So they don't care about money. They just for them it's just about procreation, so they just they have one set of clothes, and they just pass it on from one children to the other. And the birth rate has gone down as well for the Orthodox, but they still make a lot of children, and that's still a problem. But with the Arabs, it has brought a change.
I mean, I guess talking about the religious aspect as well. I mean, Crockaduk's position is essentially very strongly like Protestant work ethic, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a built-in. If we take a step back and look at your assumptions or our assumptions, because I more or less agree with you, we are basically saying that to have a sense of self need to be like a productive citizen. So work is seen as being ethically good in this model.
Yeah.
And I guess alternative models are available. Um, uh, so I mean, in a sense, we are saying like if you want to get on in this society, you need to work, which I guess comes down to values. But I can imagine some like truly radical libertarians might be saying, well, you know, what about the right to opt out, say, or what about the right not to work?
Hey, they have that right. I mean, but you know, they're kind of going to starve.
Yeah, yeah, right. I broadly agree with that. And it's like here's the thing. Here's the thing that I mean, coming back to socialism or coming back to these, you know, coming back to this basic question of, you know, should you be made to work? It is you've got to recognize that you're still like in order to get the food to your plate, a lot of work has gone into that. If you weren't paying the money to the baker to make the bread, I mean, in exchange for your $2, say, or how much is a loaf of bread? Like 60 pence? Like, it's not even a dollar, right? How much would you pay for a loaf of bread? I don't know. But in exchange for the money that you give, you know, somebody has gone, they've harvested the wheat, they've milled it down, they've, you know, made the flour, they've bothered to bake it. If you weren't paying that money, push comes to shove, you would have to go get yourself some wheat. You'd have to do all this stuff yourself. So actually, the price isn't that much to pay, really, if you think about it. Do you understand what do you understand what I'm saying? So, in a sense, in order to live in the manner to which we are accustomed, it's not that much of a cost to say, well, you know, get to work um, if you want to live, right? Am I wrong? Like, other than going back to like hunter gathering, I don't know what the alternative is.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, people shouldn't be moochers, and the state should make some sort of pen, you know, penalties. Uh,
Or at the
but
very least incentivize people to work. You know, even people who are genuinely disabled. You know, maybe they're in a wheelchair. In principle, you know, they could be given government subsidized training in programming in some language, and you know, after that they get a job. You know, doing menial basic work. You know, some very basic language they're doing with very basic shit. But you know, somebody has to be doing the coding. Um, and even though they're handicapped, they can still do this work. And eventually, you know, they accumulate enough wealth to say, okay, you know, at this point, I can sustain myself. Well, whatever assistance I've been getting from the state, that's not necessary anymore. I can now, you know, uh, begin accumulating my own capital and sort of carving out my own destiny.
What if the destiny they want to carve out as a level 20 orc on World of Warcraft?
Yeah, well, they can do
well,
that, but the state can't subsidize that lifestyle.
yeah,
They
I
got
think that in the future, you'll be able to make money out of that as well.
Well, they
Uh,
do, don't they?
PewDiePie.
There's
Yeah.
no there's isn't there the farms in China where basically like or in South Korea where there are these I can't even remember where it is somewhere in Southeast Asia they have these farms of people who are paid basically to do like the menial shit in World of Warcraft and stuff like that, like go and collect loot or go and you know
hmm.
pay this person this amount and they'll level up your character to like a level 8 by the time you return type thing,
Yeah,
which
no,
is
I think that this is the future. We will be living more and more in those virtual worlds where you can, you will build spaceships for people, or in that game, or things like that. Or you will be a wizard, and people will pay you to see, or World of Warcraft. You will be a warrior and a famous warrior, and people will pay you to join their quests or things like that. Yeah.
I'm laughing, but I can see this happening. I think you're right.
I think you're correct. I've actually seen advertisements or photographs of advertisements, and people are mockingly captioning late stage capitalism of some pretty girl, and she's posting her picture on this advertising website, and she's saying, "I will play this video game with you for these many hours for this much money."
Yep.
All right, shall we? We've been on this call for quite a while. Shall we think about wrapping?
Yeah. I think that's too long. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me, you two. And this has, as always, been nothing but a bunch of complete crock.